If the enemy invited you to church, would you believe it was mercy or a trap? The question hung silently in Anna Keller's mind on a cool Sunday morning in 1944 as the iron gate of the women's compound creaked open. The air smelled of damp earth and pine trees after a night of light rain, the kind of quiet southern morning that seemed almost peaceful if you ignored the barbed wire stretching across the horizon. Anna stood with the other German women in gray uniforms that had faded from months of washing in metal camp basins. She was 26 years old, once a baker's daughter from Hamburg, and she had learned that strange instructions usually meant trouble. A U.S. Army truck idled beyond the gate, its engine humming softly, tires dusted with red Georgia clay. The women exchanged cautious glances. No one spoke above a whisper. They had heard rumors before. Transfers, interrogations, inspections, but never this. Corporal Thomas Whitmore stepped down from the passenger side. He looked young, maybe 30, tall and broad-shouldered in a sun-faded uniform, his cap tucked under one arm. He scanned the line of prisoners, then read 6 names from a clipboard. Anna's was third. Her stomach tightened. She stepped forward because refusing was not an option. The other women followed slowly, boots crunching over gravel as they climbed into the back of the truck. No shackles, no guards shouting orders. Just Whitmore closing the tailgate with a quiet metallic click. The truck rolled out of the camp and onto a narrow country road lined with oak trees and white fences. For the first mile no one spoke. Anna kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the American countryside pass by like a moving painting. Green fields, barns painted bright red, laundry fluttering on clotheslines. It felt unreal compared to the gray ruins she remembered back home. Finally, one of the younger prisoners whispered in German, "Where are they taking us?" Whitmore must have heard the nervous murmurs because he turned slightly in his seat. His voice was calm, almost casual. "You're going to church." The words landed like a stone in still water. Church. Anna blinked, certain she had misunderstood the English. Enemy prisoners were not invited to church. They were counted, assigned work, and returned behind fences. That was the rhythm of camp life. But the truck kept moving in a few minutes. Later the road curved past a row of maple trees, revealing a small white building at the top of a gentle hill. A wooden steeple rose above it, simple and weathered. A bell rang once, then again, echoing softly across the fields. Families were already gathering outside, men in pressed shirts, women in summer dresses, children holding small black Bibles. Anna felt her breath catch as the truck slowed near the gravel driveway. Every lesson she had grown up hearing about enemies told her what should happen next. Angry stares, shouting, doors slammed shut in their faces. Instead, the bell continued ringing in the quiet morning air, and the people near the church steps simply turned to watch the truck arrive. No one moved toward them. No one ran away. They just waited, as if something unusual but not unwelcome was about to happen. Anna Keller stepped down from the truck slowly, her boots touching the pale gravel as if the ground itself might reject her. The morning air carried the faint scent of fresh-cut grass and would smoke from somewhere beyond the hill. She had expected tension the moment her feet touched American soil outside the camp gates. Instead, there was only the steady ringing of the church bell and the quiet rustle of people shifting along the wooden steps. The other German women climbed down behind her, their gray uniforms stark against the bright white siding of the small country chapel. No one rushed them. No soldier barked orders. Corporal Thomas Whitmore simply closed the truck door and nodded toward the narrow path that led to the entrance. Anna noticed that the doors of the church stood wide open. Sunlight streamed through them in long golden beams that stretched across the porch. For a moment, none of the prisoners moved. They stood in a small cluster beside the truck, uncertain whether they were truly expected to approach. A few townspeople watched with curious expressions, but the looks were not sharp or angry. They were the same quiet looks people might give strangers arriving in a place that rarely saw new faces. A boy of about 10 held his father's hand and stared openly, his eyes wide with fascination rather than suspicion. Anna lowered her gaze, feeling the familiar instinct to remain invisible. In the camp, it had always been safer to speak little and observe everything. But the silence here felt different. It was not the heavy silence of guards and rules. It was the gentle hush that settles before a service begins. Corporal Whitmore walked a few steps ahead of them and paused near the bottom of the wooden stairs. He did not point or wave them forward. He simply waited, as if the decision belonged to them. Anna noticed this small detail and felt a strange uncertainty rise inside her chest. Back in Germany before the war, she had sometimes stood outside a church with her father on early Sunday mornings. He had been a quiet man who repaired ovens and bakeries all over Hamburg, and he used to say that a church door should always open before the bell stopped ringing. The memory returned now with surprising clarity as another soft chime echoed across the field. One of the women beside her, a young typist named Marta, whispered in German that they should remain where they were. She feared this was some kind of test meant to see how the prisoners behaved among civilians. Anna could not answer. Her attention had shifted to an elderly woman standing near the top step. The woman wore a pale blue dress and held a small book against her chest. When she noticed the prisoners hesitating, she walked slowly down the stairs. Each step was careful but steady. She did not look at Corporal Whitmore for permission. She simply reached the bottom step and stopped a few feet from Anna. For a moment, the two women regarded one another across the quiet space between them. Anna expected the older woman to speak sharply or turn away in discomfort. Instead, the woman gave a small polite nod, the kind used when greeting someone new in town. Then she stepped aside and held the church door open wider. The gesture was so simple that Anna almost missed its meaning. The path was clear. No one forced them. No one warned them. The bell gave one final note above the steeple, and the open doorway waited in the warm Sunday light. Anna Keller felt the moment stretch longer than it should. The open doorway glowed with soft light, and the elderly woman remained standing beside it, her hand resting calmly on the edge of the door, as if holding it open for any ordinary guest. No one spoke. Behind Anna, the other German women shifted their weight on the gravel, uncertain whether stepping forward would break some invisible rule. In the camp, every movement had meaning. Every step could be misinterpreted. But here the quiet felt different. It was patient. Anna finally drew a slow breath and climbed the first wooden step. The boards creaked lightly beneath her boots. The sound echoed louder in her mind than the bell had moments earlier. She half expected someone to call out and stop her. No voice came. The elderly woman simply gave another gentle nod and stepped aside, allowing Anna to pass through the doorway first. The air inside the church felt cool and carried the faint scent of polished wood and old hymn books. Sunlight filtered through tall windows of colored glass, scattering soft patterns of red and gold across the wooden floor. Anna paused just inside the entrance, unsure where she should stand. The small chapel was already filled with townspeople seated in narrow rows of pews. Some turned their heads to look at the unexpected visitors, but their expressions held curiosity more than judgment. A mother placed a quiet hand on her young daughter's shoulder and whispered something that made the girl sit straighter and watch respectfully. The other German women followed Anna into the church one by one, their gray uniforms forming a line that seemed strangely out of place among the pressed shirts and summer dresses of the congregation. Corporal Thomas Whitmore entered last and remained near the back wall, not standing among them, but not leaving either. His presence was calm and watchful, like someone making sure the moment unfolded without interruption. Anna noticed that the pews near the center of the room were empty, as though someone had prepared space for them ahead of time. Marta hesitated beside her and whispered that they should remain standing near the door. Anna understood the instinct. Standing near the exit meant they could leave quickly if the mood changed. But then the elderly woman who had opened the door stepped quietly forward again. She walked to the nearest empty pew and placed her small hymn book on the wooden bench before looking back toward the prisoners. She did not gesture dramatically. She simply sat down and patted the space beside her as if inviting a neighbor to join. Anna felt a strange warmth rise in her chest that she could not immediately explain. Slowly she moved toward the bench and sat down at the far end, leaving respectful distance between herself and the woman. The wood of the pew was smooth from years of use. It felt solid beneath her hands, real in a way the temporary structures of the camp never did. Around them, the congregation settled into quiet anticipation. Somewhere near the front of the church, a man adjusted the sheet music on a small organ. Anna had not noticed the instrument before. The first soft note drifted through the room like a breath. The sound was simple and clear, filling the chapel with a familiar warmth that Anna had not heard in years. For a moment she forgot where she was. The melody reminded her of winter mornings long ago when her father had hummed softly while shaping dough in their small bakery kitchen before walking her to church down the street. The memory arrived without warning, as gentle and sudden as the music itself. The organ note lingered in the quiet air for a moment. Then another followed, and another, until the small chapel filled with a gentle melody that moved slowly through the wooden beams above. Anna Keller sat perfectly still on the edge of the pew, her hands folded together so tightly that the knuckles had turned pale. The sound of the instrument was simple, not grand like the cathedral organs she had once heard in Hamburg, but there was something honest in its tone. Each note rose clearly and then settled into the next, like footsteps across a familiar path. Around her the congregation stood as one. The movement happened softly, almost like a wave. Men straightened their jackets. Women lifted their hymn books. Children slid carefully to their feet beside their parents. Anna hesitated for only a second before standing as well. Marta rose beside her, followed by the other German women who had slowly taken seats along the same row. For a moment the difference in clothing was impossible to ignore. Gray camp uniforms among pressed shirts and light cotton dresses. Yet no one moved away. No one whispered. The elderly woman beside Anna opened her hymn book and placed it gently between them so that both could see the page. The paper had yellowed with age and the edges were soft from years of turning. Anna did not understand every English word printed on the page, but she recognized the structure of a hymn immediately. The organ continued, and then voices joined it. The first voices were quiet, almost tentative, but soon the entire room filled with sound. It was not loud in a dramatic way. It was steady and warm, the kind of singing that comes from people who have known the same song for many years. Anna listened carefully as the melody rose through the chapel. Something about the pattern of notes stirred a memory that she had not expected to find here. The rhythm reminded her of a hymn her mother used to hum while folding linens on Sunday afternoons. She had not thought about that sound in a long time. The war had pushed many small memories into distant corners of her mind, places where they rarely returned. Yet now the echo of that familiar rhythm seemed to drift gently through the American church as if it had traveled across the ocean to find her again. Marta leaned slightly closer and whispered that the words appeared to speak about mercy and rest. Anna nodded without answering. She could hear those ideas in the music even without fully understanding the language. Across the aisle a young boy struggled to hold his hymn book steady while trying to follow the tune. His father bent slightly and guided the page with one finger, showing him where the next line began. The boy nodded seriously and continued singing with determined concentration. Anna watched the small moment and felt something shift quietly inside her chest. It was a simple scene, the kind that might happen in any small town church across the country, yet seeing it now felt strangely powerful. Corporal Thomas Whitmore remained near the back wall, his hands resting loosely behind his back. He was not singing, but he listened carefully, his eyes moving across the room to make sure everything remained calm. The light from the tall windows fell across the wooden floor in soft bands of color, and the music continued to rise gently through the chapel. Anna lowered her gaze to the hymn book again. The English words were unfamiliar, but the feeling behind them was not. For the first time since stepping through the church door, she realized that the people around her were not studying the prisoners with suspicion. They were simply singing. The final note of the hymn lingered in the chapel like the last ripple on still water. For a moment no one moved. The congregation remained standing, heads slightly bowed, hands resting on worn hymn books. Anna Keller felt the silence settle around her, gentle but heavy with meaning. She realized that her hands had relaxed on the wooden bench, her fingers no longer clenched as tightly as when she first stepped through the door. The elderly woman beside her closed the hymn book carefully and offered a small smile that carried no trace of pity or judgment. It was the kind of quiet smile one might give a neighbor across a garden fence. Anna returned a hesitant nod, unsure whether such a simple exchange was allowed between prisoner and citizen. Slowly the congregation took their seats again. The soft creak of wood echoed across the chapel as dozens of people lowered themselves onto the narrow pews. Anna followed their movement, sitting carefully, aware of every sound her boots made against the polished floor. For a brief moment, she looked down at the hymn book that still rested between her and the woman beside her. The printed English words were still unfamiliar, but the shapes of the letters and the faded ink somehow felt comforting, as if the book itself carried years of quiet Sundays inside its pages. At the front of the chapel, a tall man in a dark suit stepped toward a simple wooden lectern. His hair was streaked with gray, and his posture carried the calm confidence of someone used to speaking before a room full of people. Anna assumed he must be the pastor. He waited until the room had settled completely, then rested both hands lightly on the sides of the lectern. His eyes moved slowly across the congregation. For a moment they paused on the row where the German women sat. Anna felt the attention immediately and lowered her gaze again, expecting perhaps a formal acknowledgement or a reminder that they were visitors from the camp outside town. But the pastor did not single them out. Instead, he spoke in a voice that carried easily through the quiet room. His words were steady and measured, the cadence of someone who had delivered many Sunday sermons over many years. Anna could not understand every sentence, yet she caught certain words clearly. Words like welcome, words like kindness, words like neighbor. Marta leaned slightly closer and whispered a translation of a phrase the pastor repeated several times. It spoke about showing compassion to strangers who arrive from distant places. Anna listened more carefully now. The idea was not presented as a command or a lesson meant for a specific group. It was spoken as a simple truth that belonged to everyone in the room. A few rows ahead, a young girl turned around quietly and studied the German women again, her curiosity softened by the calm tone of the pastor's voice. Her mother gently guided her attention forward once more. Anna noticed that the people around her were listening in the same thoughtful silence that had filled the room during the hymn. No one seemed distracted by the presence of prisoners among them. The pastor continued speaking, occasionally opening a small Bible resting on the lectern and reading a short passage before explaining it in plain language. Anna did not need a full translation to sense the meaning behind his voice. It was the tone that mattered. It was the way his words flowed gently through the chapel, carrying a quiet message that seemed to stretch beyond nationality or uniform. Anna felt the strange realization forming slowly in her mind. In this small wooden church on an American hillside, no one had yet reminded them that they were enemies. The pastor's voice continued to move gently through the chapel, steady and calm like a slow river that did not rush, but carried everything forward with quiet certainty. Anna Keller listened carefully, her attention drawn less to the individual English words and more to the tone behind them. Even without perfect understanding, the meaning seemed to unfold through rhythm and expression. The pastor spoke about travelers who arrive from distant lands, about people who carry burdens they did not choose, and about the responsibility of a community to recognize the humanity of those who appear unfamiliar. Marta leaned slightly closer and translated a few key phrases in a whisper. The pastor was speaking about kindness offered without expectation. He was speaking about mercy that does not ask where someone comes from before offering a seat at the table. Anna felt a slow warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she had not expected to experience inside an American church. The words did not accuse anyone. They did not speak about victory or defeat. They spoke about understanding. A few rows ahead, the same young boy who had struggled with the hymn book now sat quietly between his parents, listening with wide eyes. His feet swung gently beneath the pew, not quite touching the floor. Anna noticed the small detail and found herself wondering if children in every country behaved the same way in church when they tried their best to remain still. The thought surprised her. It was the kind of observation she had not allowed herself to make since arriving in the camp months earlier. Life there had been defined by routine and caution. But here, in this room filled with sunlight and wooden benches worn smooth by generations of worshippers, her mind drifted briefly toward ordinary things again. The pastor paused for a moment and opened the small Bible resting on the lectern. The thin pages rustled softly as he turned to a passage he seemed to know well. His voice grew slightly quieter as he read, yet every word still reached the back rows of the chapel. Anna caught one phrase clearly because the pastor repeated it twice, slowly and deliberately. It spoke about welcoming the stranger. Marta whispered the translation again, and Anna felt the words settle gently in her mind. Welcoming the stranger. The idea seemed simple, almost obvious, yet hearing it spoken here felt unexpectedly powerful. Anna glanced around the chapel once more. The congregation remained focused on the pastor, their faces calm and attentive. No one stared at the prisoners now. No one whispered about them. They were simply part of the room, sitting quietly among neighbors and families who had gathered on a peaceful Sunday morning. Near the back wall, Corporal Thomas Whitmore remained standing in the same relaxed position, his gaze moving slowly across the chapel. For a moment his eyes met Anna's. He did not smile or nod. He simply looked at her with a calm expression that seemed to say that everything unfolding here had been intentional. Anna lowered her gaze again, but this time she did not feel the same tight knot of uncertainty in her chest. Instead, she listened as the pastor closed the Bible and spoke one final thought before the prayer. He said that kindness offered during difficult times often becomes the strongest memory people carry with them long after those difficult times have passed. The words floated through the quiet chapel and settled into the stillness like a promise waiting to be understood. The chapel remained quiet after the pastor finished speaking, as if his final words had settled gently over the room and no one wanted to disturb them too quickly. For a moment, the only sound came from the faint ticking of a wall clock somewhere near the back door. Anna Keller sat still on the wooden pew, her hands resting loosely on the closed hymn book. The phrase welcoming the stranger continued to echo quietly in her thoughts. It felt strange to hear such words in a place where she had expected suspicion. The pastor bowed his head and invited the congregation to pray. Instantly the room moved again as one calm motion. Heads lowered, hands folded. Even the young boy who had struggled earlier with his hymn book now sat very still, copying the posture of his father beside him. Anna hesitated for a second before lowering her own head. Prayer had once been a normal part of her life. Sunday mornings in Hamburg had begun with the soft ringing of bells and the smell of bread cooling in her father's bakery. Those memories had faded during the long months behind the fences of the camp, yet now they returned quietly as she closed her eyes. The pastor spoke slowly, his voice softer than before, but still clear enough to reach every corner of the chapel. He spoke about peace for families separated by war. He spoke about strength for those who carried uncertainty. He spoke about compassion that crosses borders people believe cannot be crossed. Anna did not understand every sentence, yet the rhythm of the prayer felt familiar, almost comforting. Beside her, the elderly woman remained very still, her hands folded gently in her lap. Anna noticed that the woman's fingers were slightly worn and rough, the hands of someone who worked often in a garden or kitchen. It reminded her of her own mother's hands years ago when she helped in the bakery before sunrise. The thought made Anna swallow quietly as the prayer continued. Across the chapel the sunlight had shifted slightly, falling now across the center aisle in soft golden lines. Dust moved slowly through the light like tiny drifting particles, visible only because the morning sun had found them. The stillness of the room felt deeper than silence. It felt like a pause in the world beyond the church walls. Finally, the pastor lifted his head and said a quiet word of conclusion. The congregation answered together with a soft amen that rolled gently through the room. People slowly raised their heads, and the chapel seemed to breathe again. A few hymn books opened once more as the organist adjusted the sheet music for another song. Anna glanced toward the back of the church, where Corporal Thomas Whitmore still stood near the wall. His posture had not changed, but his attention remained steady on the room, as though he had been watching the entire moment unfold from a respectful distance. Anna wondered briefly how the idea for this visit had begun. It did not feel accidental. It felt planned with careful thought. Marta leaned slightly closer and whispered that she had never imagined hearing an American congregation pray for peace that included people on both sides of the ocean. Anna nodded slowly. The surprise was not loud or dramatic. It was quieter than that. It was the slow realization that something unexpected had happened in this small wooden church. For nearly an hour, no one had treated them like prisoners. They had simply been people sitting in a pew. The organ began to play again, softly at first, as if it understood that the quiet inside the chapel should not be broken too quickly. The melody was slower than the first hymn, gentle and steady, and the congregation rose once more in unison. Anna Keller followed their movement almost without thinking. Standing no longer felt strange. The rhythm of the service had begun to feel natural, like stepping into a pattern that already existed long before she arrived. The elderly woman beside her opened the hymn book again and turned it slightly so Anna could see the page more clearly. This time Anna recognized a few English words. They were simple words about light, about hope, about walking through difficult days without losing faith. The congregation began to sing, and the sound rose slowly through the wooden chapel. It was not the polished harmony of a choir trained for performance. It was the honest sound of ordinary voices singing together, each person carrying their part of the melody. Anna listened closely, and after a moment she noticed something unexpected. The tune itself was familiar, not identical, but close enough to stir a memory she had not felt since childhood. A similar melody had once been sung in a small Lutheran church near her family's bakery in Hamburg. On cold winter mornings the congregation there would sing it while snow gathered quietly along the window ledges. The memory arrived gently, like sunlight through the colored glass above the pews. Without realizing it, Anna found herself quietly following the melody under her breath. She did not know the English words, but the tune guided her. Beside her, Marta glanced over in surprise, and then smiled slightly before returning her attention to the hymn book. Across the aisle the young boy sang with great effort, stretching each note with determination. His voice was not perfectly in tune, but he sang with such sincerity that it added something warm to the sound filling the chapel. His father placed a steady hand on the boy's shoulder, encouraging him to continue. The moment was small, almost ordinary, yet Anna noticed it with unusual clarity. The congregation sang the final line together and then slowly lowered their voices until the organ carried the last note alone. Silence returned again, soft and unforced. The pastor stepped forward once more and offered a brief closing blessing. His words were simple and spoken with quiet conviction. He spoke about leaving the chapel with kindness in one's actions, about carrying patience into the week ahead, and about remembering that every person encountered along the road of life carried a story not always visible to others. Anna listened carefully to Marta's whispered translation and felt the message settle in her thoughts. It was not a grand speech. It was something quieter than that. The pastor then closed the Bible gently and nodded toward the congregation. People began to move slowly, gathering hymn books and stepping into the center aisle. The service had ended, yet the calm atmosphere inside the chapel remained, like the last warmth left in a room after a fire has gone out. Anna stayed seated for a moment longer, watching as families greeted one another quietly near the doorway. She noticed that no one seemed hurried to leave. The church doors stood open to the bright Sunday morning outside, and the sound of birds drifted softly through the entrance. For the first time since arriving at the camp months earlier, Anna realized she had just experienced an entire hour in which fear had not guided her thoughts. It was a small realization, but it felt unexpectedly powerful as she rose slowly from the pew. Anna Keller stood slowly as the last people began to move toward the aisle, her hand resting lightly on the back of the wooden pew. The chapel felt different now that the service had ended. The quiet order of the hymns and prayers had given way to the gentle sounds of conversation. Families greeted one another with soft voices. A man near the front laughed quietly at something his friend had said. The young boy who had sung so determinedly earlier now ran a few small steps down the aisle before his mother gently caught his arm and guided him back beside her. The movement felt natural, like the calm rhythm of a place that had followed the same routine for many years. Anna waited for a moment, unsure whether the prisoners were expected to leave immediately or remain where they were. Marta rose beside her and glanced toward the open door where sunlight poured across the floorboards. The bright light outside made the colored patterns from the stained glass fade slightly as the morning grew stronger. Slowly the German women stepped into the aisle together. Their gray uniforms still marked them as outsiders among the neatly dressed townspeople, yet the difference no longer felt as sharp as it had when they first entered the building. People made space politely as they passed. One elderly man tipped his hat slightly in greeting without speaking. Anna returned the gesture with a quiet nod, surprised by how simple the exchange felt. Near the back wall, Corporal Thomas Whitmore finally stepped forward from his place of quiet observation. His posture remained relaxed, his expression calm. He did not rush the women or signal that they needed to leave immediately. Instead, he waited near the doorway, allowing the congregation to pass first. Anna noticed this small act of patience and wondered again how carefully this visit must have been arranged. As she approached the door, she felt the warm air of the late morning drifting into the chapel. The scent of grass and distant pine trees returned, carried on a light breeze that moved through the open entrance. Outside, People gathered along the gravel path and the wide lawn that surrounded the church. Some spoke in small groups, while others walked slowly toward wagons and automobiles parked beneath the shade of tall oak trees. Anna stepped onto the wooden porch and paused for a moment. The sky stretched wide and clear above the hillside, a deep blue that seemed brighter than she remembered from inside the camp fences. Marta stood beside her and whispered that she could hardly believe the hour had passed so quietly. Anna nodded in agreement. It had not felt like time spent under watch or supervision. It had felt like something ordinary. Corporal Whitmore joined them near the steps and gestured calmly toward the path that led back to the waiting truck. His voice remained gentle as he told them they would return to the camp shortly. Anna looked back once more toward the open door of the chapel. Through the entrance, she could still see the wooden pew where she had sat, and the hymn book resting quietly on the bench. The elderly woman who had shared the book now stood near the doorway speaking with another member of the congregation. When she noticed Anna looking back, she offered the same small, warm smile as before. The gesture lasted only a second, but it carried a meaning Anna understood clearly. For that brief hour inside the chapel, she had not been seen as a prisoner or an enemy. She had simply been another person sitting in the sunlight among neighbors. Anna Keller followed the narrow gravel path slowly, her boots making soft crunching sounds beneath each step as the group moved away from the church porch. The morning sun had climbed higher now, warming the wide hillside that surrounded the small chapel. Families lingered on the grass, speaking in relaxed conversations that drifted through the clear air. A few children chased one another between the oak trees while their parents gathered near the parked automobiles and wagons. The peaceful scene felt almost unreal to Anna. For months her world had been measured by the straight lines of fences and the routine sounds of the camp bell marking the hours. Here, time seemed to move differently. Marta walked beside her, glancing around as if trying to memorize every detail of the place. She whispered quietly that the people did not seem afraid of them. Anna nodded. The thought had been forming in her mind as well. The congregation had looked at them with curiosity, yes, but not with hostility. That alone felt remarkable. Corporal Thomas Whitmore walked a few steps ahead of the women, guiding them back toward the truck that waited beside the church road. His pace was unhurried, allowing them to follow naturally rather than driving them forward. Anna noticed again how deliberate his manner seemed. Nothing about the morning had been rushed or forced. Even the departure felt respectful, as if the moment deserved to end calmly rather than abruptly. When they reached the truck, the women paused briefly before climbing into the back. Anna placed one hand on the metal edge of the tailgate and looked back toward the church lawn one last time. The elderly woman who had shared the hymn book had stepped onto the porch again. She stood beside the open door speaking with another member of the congregation. For a moment the woman glanced toward the road where the truck waited. Their eyes met across the distance. The woman lifted one hand in a small wave, not dramatic or formal, simply a quiet farewell. Anna felt a faint warmth spread through her chest and returned the gesture with a small nod. Then she climbed into the truck beside Marta. The engine started a moment later with a low rumble, and the vehicle rolled slowly down the narrow country road. The white church grew smaller behind them as the trees closed in along the roadside. Marta leaned forward slightly, watching the building disappear behind a bend in the road. She said softly that she had not expected kindness to feel so ordinary. Anna considered the thought carefully. The hour they had just spent inside the chapel had not been filled with dramatic speeches or grand gestures. It had been something quieter than that. It had been in books shared across a pew. It had been a prayer spoken for people on both sides of a war. It had been strangers sitting together in the same sunlight without fear. The truck continued along the road, passing green pastures and wooden fences that stretched across the countryside. Anna rested her hands in her lap and looked out at the landscape rolling gently past. The camp would appear again soon beyond the next hill, with its guard towers and familiar routines. Yet something about the morning would remain with her long after the church had disappeared from view. For one quiet hour in a small American chapel, the distance between enemies had grown unexpectedly smaller. The truck continued along the quiet country road, its tires humming softly over the packed dirt as the church disappeared behind a line of tall oak trees. Anna Keller watched the landscape pass in silence. The green fields stretched wide beneath the clear sky, broken only by wooden fences and the occasional farmhouse sitting far back from the road. The peaceful scenery felt strangely distant from the life she had known since arriving in the prisoner camp. Yet the memory of the small chapel remained vivid in her thoughts, as clear as the sunlight that had filled its windows. Marta sat beside her, her hands resting loosely on her knees as she stared toward the horizon. For a long time, neither woman spoke. Finally, Marta broke the silence with a quiet observation. She said that the pastor's words about welcoming strangers would probably stay with her for the rest of her life. Anna considered the statement carefully before nodding. The words themselves had been simple, yet the way they had been spoken inside that room had given them unexpected weight. Corporal Thomas Whitmore drove steadily from the front seat, guiding the truck along the familiar road that led back toward the camp. His posture remained calm, his attention fixed on the road ahead. After several minutes, he slowed the vehicle slightly and glanced over his shoulder toward the women in the back. His voice carried clearly above the sound of the engine when he spoke. He asked if the service had been comfortable for them. The question surprised Anna. It was not the kind of question guards usually asked prisoners. Marta answered first, thanking him quietly and saying that the visit had meant more than she could easily explain. Anna added her own quiet thanks a moment later. Whitmore nodded once and returned his attention to the road, without making the moment feel formal or uncomfortable. The truck continued forward until the outline of the camp began to appear beyond the next rise in the land. The familiar shape of the watchtower stood against the sky, and the long fence stretched across the field like a straight gray line. Anna felt the shift immediately. The calm memory of the chapel and the routine structure of the camp now existed, side by side in her thoughts. As the truck rolled through the gate and came to a stop near the women's compound, the normal sounds of camp life returned. Voices called across the yard. Boots moved across gravel. The steady rhythm of the place resumed around them. Anna climbed down from the truck beside Marta and turned briefly to thank Corporal Whitmore again. He offered a small nod of acknowledgement before closing the tailgate. The moment was simple and quiet, yet it carried meaning that neither of them felt the need to explain. As Anna walked back toward the barracks, she noticed that the other women who had remained in the compound were watching them with curiosity. Questions would certainly follow. Marta leaned closer and whispered that she would not know where to begin describing the morning. Anna thought about the hymn, the prayer, and the pastor's calm voice speaking about kindness that crosses borders. Then she remembered the small moment when the elderly woman had shared the hymn book without hesitation. Anna smiled faintly and replied that sometimes the most important parts of a story were the quietest ones. The rest of the afternoon passed with the familiar rhythm of camp life. Yet something quiet had changed in the way Anna Keller carried herself as she moved through the yard. The routine was the same as it had always been. Women walked between the barracks and the laundry station. A guard called instructions from near the storage shed. The wind moved softly across the open field beyond the fence, carrying the faint scent of pine from the distant tree line. Nothing about the camp itself had altered, yet Anna felt the memory of the chapel lingering like a warm light that had followed her back through the gates. By late afternoon, several of the women gathered inside the barracks where the wooden walls held the heat of the day. Marta sat on the edge of one of the narrow bunks while a few others leaned closer, eager to hear every detail of the morning. Questions came quickly. They wanted to know if the townspeople had stared at them. They wanted to know whether the pastor had spoken about the war. They wanted to know if the guards had watched closely during the entire service. Marta answered patiently, describing the quiet singing, the sunlight through the tall windows, and the moment when the pastor spoke about welcoming strangers from distant places. Some of the women listened with disbelief. Others fell silent as they tried to imagine the scene. Anna remained near the small window at the end of the room, her hands resting lightly on the wooden frame as she watched the sky slowly turning softer with the approach of evening. When one of the younger prisoners asked whether the Americans had seemed angry or resentful, Anna turned from the window and shook her head gently. She explained that the most surprising part of the morning had not been any dramatic gesture. It had been the absence of hostility. People had simply shared the same space without suspicion. She described the elderly woman who had opened the hymn book and the young boy who had sung every line with determined effort. As Anna spoke, she realized that the small details were the ones she remembered most clearly. The quiet smile at the doorway, the shared page of a worn hymn book, the pastor's steady voice speaking about kindness that crosses borders. The women listened carefully, their expressions thoughtful as the story unfolded. Marta finally added that the visit had not felt like a performance arranged for prisoners. It had felt genuine, as though the people in that church truly believed the words they sang and prayed together. The room fell silent for a moment after she said this. Outside, the evening light stretched across the camp yard, turning the dust along the ground into a soft golden color. Anna looked once more through the small window, toward the horizon where the sky met the distant trees. She knew that tomorrow the routine of the camp would continue exactly as before. Yet something about the morning remained steady in her mind. The memory was not loud or dramatic. It was quieter than that. It was the understanding that beyond the fences there existed places where strangers could sit side by side without fear, if only for an hour, and remember that the distance between enemies was sometimes smaller than the world believed. That evening the sky above the camp slowly turned from pale gold to deep blue as the sun disappeared beyond the line of distant trees. The air cooled gently, and a quiet calm settled over the rows of wooden barracks. Anna Keller sat on the narrow step outside the building, her hands folded loosely in her lap as she watched the last light fade across the open field beyond the fence. Around her the usual sounds of the camp softened as the day came to its end. A few women spoke quietly near the doorway. Someone laughed softly at a story carried from inside the barracks. The wind moved through the grass outside the wire, creating a slow rustling sound that reminded Anna of the countryside roads she had seen earlier that morning. Marta stepped outside and sat beside her, following Anna's gaze toward the darkening horizon. For a while neither woman spoke. The silence between them felt thoughtful rather than heavy. Finally Marta said quietly that she kept replaying the sound of the hymn in her mind. Anna nodded. The melody had stayed with her as well, drifting back through her thoughts again and again like a gentle echo. It was strange how a simple song could carry so many memories with it. Anna thought about the pastor's voice and the calm way he had spoken about kindness that crosses borders. She thought about the elderly woman sharing the hymn book without hesitation. She thought about the moment when the congregation had bowed their heads in prayer and no one had treated the prisoners as outsiders. These memories did not erase the reality of the war or the fences that surrounded them. Yet they had opened a quiet space inside her thoughts where something different could exist. Marta finally asked whether Anna believed the people in that church would remember the visit after the war ended. Anna considered the question carefully before answering. She said that perhaps some would remember and others would forget. But the important thing was that for one morning those people had acted according to the words they believed in. They had opened a door and allowed strangers to step inside without fear. Marta listened thoughtfully and then smiled faintly. The lights inside the barracks flickered on as evening settled fully across the camp. Anna rose slowly from the step and glanced once more toward the dark horizon beyond the fence. Somewhere beyond those fields stood the small white chapel where sunlight had passed through colored glass and ordinary voices had sung about hope. The distance between that quiet place and the camp seemed large in miles, yet the memory of it remained close. In her mind, Anna understood that the war would one day end and the world would change in ways no one could fully predict. Yet she believed that moments like the one she had experienced that morning would remain long after the fences were gone. Not because they were dramatic, but because they revealed something simple and enduring about people. Even in a time defined by division, a small church on a hillside had chosen to treat strangers as neighbors for an hour. And sometimes an hour was enough to remind someone what humanity sounded like when it gathered together and sang.